things we have to think about all the time, trees and risk in Central Florida, since given that we have some of the most catastrophic weather in all of the country. We don't really think about it sometimes, but relative to other places that really don't have the amount of catastrophic weather, which is the matter of life. But it's something that I'm hoping that like to shift some perspective here on how you guys look at trees and think about like what you can and can't do in terms of managing the trees on your personal property as well. So just to get into it here, we got to try and cover some basic language. So, what comprises a tree? The very first thing is a trunk. Trunks are, they hold up the entirety of the tree for the most part above ground. That's something that we're all kind of familiar with, is, you know, like from being a kids and onward, but it's something that it's still a very key concept in terms of how trees are mechanically deal with stress. And so not just the trunk, but as you move up the main trunk of it, you know, like when you get into areas where there's branches and other trunks, you want to think of the main trunk. We call that the leader. And then from here, you can see that sometimes leaders will develop multiple places where there is no leader anymore. And we call these whorls or a branch cluster. And then when you have these main branches that come off, they're called main limbs or scaffolds, kind of like a scaffold on a ship. And so something to think about with these main limbs that come off of it is that you'll have the aspect ratio is key. So like a small aspect ratio is anything below 2 to 5 in terms of the fraction between those two things. Like if so you can see here that this A is probably less than 2 to 5 in terms of how it compares in terms of circumference relative to the overall stem of the branch here. And a large aspect, a branch that has a large aspect is anything 3 to 5 or bigger. So, and these unions aren't as weak. I'll get into this here and try and demonstrate it to you. But this is something you can try with branches yourselves. If you ever find like little branches and you try and pull apart two branches or stems that are pretty much the same size, it doesn't take a lot of force. Relative, if you find one that has a small branch connected into a larger branch, it will. So something else to think about here is how trees grow in nature, and that when trees grow in nature, a lot of times they grow straight up, and the reason for that is that they're growing in forests. They're trying to grow towards light gaps in the canopy, and so that forces that there to only be one stem. And this is actually a much stronger form a lot of times, because you're forcing all of the weight and the gravity in the one central stem, and the tree isn't being pulled in multiple directions by its own weight, so to speak. So so these forest-grown trees typically have pretty good form or pretty good strength a lot of the time. And another thing to keep in mind is they're all supporting each other at the top of the canopy. So like they're able to distribute their weight on other trees as well. They can lean on each other. But this is not the case in urban areas, where this is something that you'll encounter more over the lifespan of a tree. You know, like you'll have a little nursery tree that'll grow up, and when you put them in urban environments, a lot of times they grow outward instead of upward. And This kind of depends on tree species. There are certain trees that will grow outward much more rapidly, much more readily than other trees. But over the course of the life of a lot of trees, we call this form decurrent, where it's kind of circular or outward. A lot of trees they'll tend to do this, and instead of putting their weight on the one main stem, they'll distribute it like over multiple stems that are actually competing with that central leader that we were talking about for light. And I mean, it's a negative consequence of growing in an environment where there's actually that isn't all that natural for a lot of trees. So it's like if you or I were to just keep eating junk food all the time, we would probably grow in ways that we don't necessarily want to grow. Like these trees are oversaturated with light, and so they grow in ways that kind of hurts their physiology in the long term. And you can see here, this is how we would deal with these trees a lot of times. We would just kind of clear out the branches towards the bottom. But really, like when the point in the life of the tree that like it was most important that you could have controlled for all of this was when they were much smaller. So I'll show you all later like how to think about trees throughout in managing them over their entire lives, and not just as a response to like a hurricane that's coming. That's something that has to be done somewhat regularly, is the maintenance of trees with pruning. But particularly when they're I don't know, the first 2 to 15 years of when they're in the ground is when homeowners have the most influence over them. So like as I mentioned, there are some trees that even in these open environments, they don't tend to have a lot of branches that grow outward. They tend to grow upward. We call this excurrent. And here's an example here. This is a southern magnolia. You can see that it kind of has a pyramidal type shape. And you've got one central stem the whole way through it. And it's a very well adapted tree for hurricanes. Some other examples around here that kind of have this form are cypresses. Cypresses tend to do this. One that we like a lot of the podocarpuses, they'll do that quite a bit. So it's something to keep in mind. That some trees have more resistance based on their physiology than others, and this is one of them. Unfortunately, our most common trees in Florida that we use, like a canopy tree, is the live oak. This isn't a live oak, but it's another type of oak. And you can see that, like what we were talking about in terms of this aspect ratio, this ratio of the branch relative to the main stem, it's very large. And so you can even see here where one of the branches broke out from it. And that's something that you would kind of expect to have happen as these trees mature. They're more likely to have develop big risk features, big branches that might become brittle and fall off from the tree over time. And that wouldn't be so much the case with these trees. Like they have more of this pyramidal type form, this excurrent form. So there is a way to deal with this. If you do grow some of these live oaks or some of these other oak, a lot of these other trees that have more of this decurrent or circular form, you can train them to an extent to have a central leader. As you can see here, here's a live oak that has where they've pruned this tree to have a central leader. You still have these branches with large aspect ratios, but at least they're able to connect into a main leader, which isn't always the case for a lot of live oaks. Fortunately, live oaks are pretty strong trees, but it doesn't hurt them to have better form and mechanics as well. Unfortunately, what happens a lot of the time is that you have people that will try and prune a tree like after the fact that it's already developed bad form. So on the right hand side here, you can see that these are trees that they were not trimmed or they were not pruned to have a central leader. So consequently, they have multiple leading stems. None of them is dominant over the other. And they connect at common points towards the base of the tree. So, and also what's going on here is somebody came through and cleared out the bottom portions of this tree. We call this lifting. So when this happens, it's not ideal for the trees because you're actually taking all the force that is hitting these trees in the canopy with the wind. It's actually moving to the base of these trees, and I'll go ahead and demonstrate this here a little bit more in detail a little further along here. So just to kind of show this point a little bit more, you can see that when mass hits these trees, when force hits these trees, that, you know, in one of these live oaks where you have this large aspect ratio, it's going to be forced much more readily, like at that union. That's a lot of force that this tree has to withstand at the union of the tree, the union of the branch to the trunk in this tree. Whereas this tree on the right-hand side, you can see that even though these are pretty big branches, they fit pretty well. They're still relatively small in comparison to the overall trunk and leading areas of this tree. So this tree can probably it can distribute the weight onto the trunk and consequently into the ground better than the tree on the left-hand side. So yeah, this is going back to what I was kind of talking about. Another illustration here of aspect ratio that you can still have a lot of times, like branches with large aspect, you know, relative to the small aspect. But what's even worse is having this aspect where where you have codominance. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio as opposed to a 3-to-5 or above in a large aspect, or 2-to-5 or below for small aspect ratio. And so when this happens, they're sharing the structural internally. So we're going to give you guys a perspective here on what that looks like. You can see here that this is what happens on the left-hand side is when you have a tree that is growing a branch normally, and you can see that it's kind of compartmentalized. It's separate from what's going on inside of the stem. This tree on the right-hand side, you have the branches, well, in that have broken off from each other and formed two dominant stems together, and all their structure is shared internally. And that's not the case here with this branch. And so you can see that on the right here, what this illustration, this photo shows is that the branch doesn't reach into the tree. The tree actually wraps itself and surrounds and reinforces this union between the branch and the stem. And that can't take place in these trees that have codominant stems. It's all shared, and it can result in negative consequences. But as this tree grows that's growing with a normal branch, you can see here, this is what it looks like. It'll kind of envelop the branch as it grows. They'll grow together, but like you will reinforce it and grow year to year with it. And that's what's being shown here in this photo, is that these branches can be wrapped up over time, in a sense. And then you can see here, I think this is a cypress or a pine. I'm not sure exactly, but this is what these unions look like. Much more visible in some trees than others. So yeah, just going back, there's no overlap there. Like it's just that this shared internal structure. And so I'll give you a cross-section view here. On the right hand, or on the left hand side, this is a cut from a tree that has two stems that were diverging from each other, two dominant leaders that were diverging. So you can see the points where the pith are. The pith is the very center of the stem where the tree grew up originally. And so you've got two center points here right underneath where the divergence occurs. So if you were to put a bunch of stress on one side of the tree, you might have negative consequences in other parts of the tree internally. So if you look here, like one side, if we were to just apply force on this right-hand side here, it would create a cleaving force on the union, and it's internally. This is not a very strong union, as like the internal union of one of the branches. And so eventually the trees, if the union isn't very good, it will eventually separate. And if the stress is strong enough, the union's not strong enough, like it can lead to negative consequences where the tree falls apart. So as bad as that is, like, you know, this situation is, it can be manageable. As you can see here, these are examples of union where there's no bark included. And that's kind of the point here too. At least we're not even seeing bark right there. But if the branch, if it's formed in a very narrow way, sometimes, like, there can be bark in between. These trees don't even have that. So at least this isn't an ideal situation, but it can be worse.
Hey, John,
Yes.
You just cut out for a minute there. Could you just repeat what you said on that last slide? It got cut out.
Okay. All I was saying was that there are sometimes, you know, these unions, these U-shaped unions where there's no bark included. That's a much more ideal situation than where it can be, I guess you would say, more V-shaped, where there's very narrow unions and there's bark growing in between. So, and that's where I'm getting to here, is that this is in contrast to these U-shaped unions, you get these V-shaped unions sometimes. And it's pretty common to see in a lot of live oaks around here in Florida, is that as the tree grows, the tree also has been growing bark this whole time, and it gets stuck internally as these trees are expanding. That's how they grow outward. They gain in circumference as they grow. And you can see here's an indication that, like, this tree is actually under stress because there's a swollen rib underneath of it as well. So this tree is responding to the stress and trying to grow to deal with it to a certain extent. Not all trees can do this over time, and it's still not ideal. So here's what that tree would look like internally, is that there's these bark. If you were to get a cross section, like somewhere up here where the bark is still included. It's still sitting there. After a while, as the tree grows, new unions can grow where the wood looks relatively normal, and it will eventually kind of close up. But it can kind of, you know, it can, in a sense, this damage can be overcome. But sometimes there's too much bark included, and unfortunately, when the bark is there and if the tree is still growing and there's still an opening related to the bark, it allows for water to get in, and that can lead to decay and other issues. So here you can see where a tree never really overcame this included bark, and the water got in, and you can see this discoloration internally. That's from decay that was developing as a consequence of never really being able to seal up. So here is a tree that that you can see that has included bark all the way to the base of the tree. It's a tree that actually would have had 2 stems from the very beginning, and it's probably not a very good long-term strategy for a tree to do this if it wants to make it to a nice old age. And consequently, this tree broke like at the base from that. So this is just an example. I guess this is up in Gainesville, Florida. These are all, a lot of this is from work from Dr. Gilman. He was one of the lead researchers on tree risk and tree mechanics. And fortunately, we had him here in Florida, so we've got a pretty, good amount of photos that are relevant to us here when we're talking about how we want to interpret tree physiology in respect to managing stress from winds and other forces we might encounter from hurricanes. So one of the things to keep in mind as well is taper for stems. And if you see on the left-hand side, this is an example of a tree that has a fair amount of taper to it. And you can see that like it's not uniform in circumference all the way around. And if you look, I'm going to show you what happens, like this tree that has taper, it's able to distribute this force a little more uniformly through the entirety of the tree stem, whereas these trees that do not have taper, it's much more likely to be forced onto the base of it. So you can see that a tree with taper, it will have bend to it. It will be able to bend with the wind somewhat, as opposed to a tree that doesn't have taper, all that force is kind of being pushed into the base of it. And this principle is true for branches as well. The branches without taper will do the same thing and will force all of this stress onto the base. So another concept to keep in mind in terms of how trees distribute force is mass damping. So we use this principle when we design skyscraper buildings. And so just for example here, let's just say that this building is 100 stories tall. There's a mass damper unit that sits at the top of these large skyscrapers a lot of the time. And it's just a big weight, a big counterbalance for when they do encounter very large forces. So let's just say that the building starts to, it's struck by a force, it shifts, but what happens is there's empty space in the tops of these a lot of the time, and the counterbalance will move. If the building moves to the right, the counterbalance will move to the left, or it'll remain in place, and the building's able to recover with a lot less sporadic force than if like there hadn't been that damper there. So and at that point, when it's corrected, the mass swings right, and then they're able to kind of equilibrate. Yeah, I've got some demonstrations of this that I could show you at some point here. Or maybe I'll include it like on the post when I get back to you guys over email at the end of this. So another thing to keep in mind is how wind moves through the canopy. It actually moves, we can't really see wind, but when it's flowing over the canopy, it's kind of think of it moving in tubes. That tends to be how gusts, the most powerful parts of the storm, these gusts move around. And like usually they're hitting towards the top of the canopy, they're not making it all the way to the ground necessarily. So if you have this mass damper effect in play, the parts that are being affected are the tops of the canopy. The outer branches are the ones that are assuming the force. And if you have these branches, the force will move down all the way to the base of the tree. But along the way, you've got all these smaller branches, and they act as dampers. They're able to move, they're able to absorb a lot of the weight, and they move around like the counterbalance that we showed, like with the mass damping unit in these skyscrapers. It's a net effect because there's a lot more of them, but the trees will actually move a lot with the wind. They'll be moving a lot, and that's a good thing because it allows the force to be distributed better than if those smaller branches weren't there. And so that means generally like there's going to be less breakages overall because the force is being distributed. Unfortunately, we get this idea a lot of the time in Florida that we want more wind to be able to flow through the trees. And this couldn't be any more further away from what we want in a lot of circumstances. When we prune trees this way, that there are no lower branches left. There's only these large areas of leaf area towards the top. And in effect, these areas are actually almost acting like sails or kites, or they're capturing the force of the wind, and that force, instead of moving through these smaller branches that would have distributed the weight, the force, it's all being shifted towards the base of these trees. And so like these branches are moving much more instead of staying stationary. Like the branches are moving all over the place now, which can potentially lead to them snapping off. Yeah, and that's what these wind tubes hit here. Eventually, like that can lead to these branches snapping and failing. So just to get into a little bit of physics here, you've got your force, the moment, and the lever arm action. So the bending moment is where how much force is allocated in the spot where the stress is being forced towards. So I know that's a little redundant, but like instead of the force being moved over the entirety of this tree, for example, it's being accumulated towards the bottom here. And then if you take into account the length of the lever arm, you can take the force and the lever arm act together to put a lot of to make that force, make that bending moment, which is actually an amplification of energy at a certain point. So here's an example of a tree that has large aspect ratio branches, and they're meeting at a central point. They don't have a lot of small branches to distribute weight along them. And it probably can't deal with the wind that, from a tropical system very well because of this. And it's not that it's going to fall over from the base. It's these big branches that we have to be thinking about. So if you were to put 100 pounds at the top of this, even if you were just to hang 100 pounds from the top of it, not even something hitting it with force, and then you look at the length of it, 25 feet, you would have 2,500 pounds of the moment would equal 2,500 pounds of force at the base of this. So that's something, how just a little bit of weight at the top of this can be amplified quite a bit just by how physics works. Basically, if you can think of leverage and how a lever arm works for twisting something, the longer that it is, the more you're able to, less force it takes to open something up. It's kind of a similar principle here. And so the consequences of this a lot of the time is that you get breakages, like like when you have these large aspect ratios and you have these branches, very large branches that reach up, and you have these canopies cleared. This is what happens a lot of times. This is an example from Singapore. and where they looked at like how trees failed under tropical and hurricane, well, I guess they would be cyclones there, cyclone events, typhoons. And basically, like, there were a lot more breakages that happened due to the branches breaking off than just the trunk or the roots occurring. This was the majority of the problems that were that occurred, and this is actually something that is fairly preventable on our behalf. Sometimes these root conditions and things like that can't be helped, but this is something that, like, with proper pruning, we could have, well, that we can deal with, like, over the course of the long run here. So I guess I just want to have like a minor review right here, just to kind of cover some of the concepts that we've covered in a little more detail. Trees mostly fail due to poor structure and mechanics, and then they develop like risk features associated with that. And what makes poor structure worse is cultural practices that can lead to issues with the tree, like as you can see here. I'm in the middle of the talk here.
Okay. So, well, you're gonna be, how long are you gonna be, you think?
Yeah. Probably, let's see here.
Half hour?
By 4.
Okay, because I'm bringing up her thing by, I'll get you to look at it.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, bad cultural practices as well can make these conditions a lot worse, because what happens a lot of times, we try and compensate for what could have been done over the long term, and we do something that's reactionary, but this tree hasn't had time to grow in the proper ways. It's almost like if you tried to train this tree for a marathon, like it's the most stressful thing that you can make it go under in less than a week. So that's something that we have to keep in mind here, is that and we're not all arborists. We don't have time to think about these things, but we actually have the most control over trees in terms of how they're going to perform in storms and other stressful events when they're much smaller and manageable for us as homeowners. So how can we make trees more resistant to storms and extend their lives? Like I was mentioning here, we can try and develop their form as they mature. So like trying to take this central stem and keep that central stem intact all the way until it's a large tree. But unfortunately, what we get a lot of times is we get a tree from a nursery, we put it in the ground, and you kind of have these stems that will start growing outward and competing with the central leader. You can see the central leader here, and this is a tree that it hasn't had any pruning since it was put in the ground, and this would be the ideal leader. If they should have at some point reduced these stems, or like reduced them, or tried to. There's a couple ways that you can do this, but basically like pruning them so that they're not competing with the leader so much. Because eventually, this is the same tree here on the left-hand side. It turns into a problem that becomes much more difficult to deal with as the tree matures. So 14 years later, these limbs are they're getting to be almost the same size as the leader. And so, this tree might be able to live this way and persist for a long time, but ultimately, like the things as they grow, like these situations that don't seem to be very nefarious, like in most day-to-day situations, can lead to issues much larger issues down the road. So just think about that. Maybe, yeah, and I guess a thing to lead into that, I'll try to have some classes on pruning down the road and kind of get more into what homeowners can do as opposed to kind of like when trees are mature and that's when arborists have to deal with them. Kind of thinking of this much more in like the entire system, the entire maturation cycle of trees, and you have a lot of control as homeowners, much more than you think that you do, if you can manage to keep that central leader intact.
John, we had a couple questions if you want to take them now.
Okay, I've got some more stuff I'm going to go over here, but I can take them now.
They were related to pruning. Marlene asks, if I have a young tree growing wrong, how can I correct it?
So if you have a young tree, well, first off, you have to make sure that when you get a tree, that you give it time to establish into the ground. The biggest thing when you put the tree into the ground, or when you put a new tree on a new site, that you want to let the roots develop and for the tree to be able to supply itself with water and nutrients from the ground, that it's firmly in place, etc. So actually the first couple years that you put a tree in the ground, you don't really want to do a whole lot, typically. After a couple of years, then it's usually safe to go ahead and move on to doing some pruning and basically like trying to correct it in a sense. I mean, and it kind of varies from situation to situation, but you want to prune a tree so that there's one central leader. There's a couple of ways to do this. It kind of depends on how the branches are growing in respect to each other, but you know, the younger the tree, the better, and the easier it is to respond to the stresses of being pruned.
And add on to that question, Marlene wants to know, do I need to cut branches at an angle always?
When you cut branches, I mean, you like it's its own thing here, and I mean, like you probably there's different types of cuts that you can do. So I'm not sure I really understand like what's meant there, but yeah, you definitely, if you're cutting it to the stem, it should be at kind of an angle. It shouldn't be what you would call a flush cut, like where it's straight down along the base of the stem. The tree can recover usually a little bit more if you cut kind of at an angle from the branch union.
Thanks. And then Elena has a question. What about fruit trees that you want to keep short?
Fruit trees, typically, I mean, for the most part, depending on the variety, but a lot of them are dwarfs to begin with. They're trees that don't really have a form that grows that high. I mean, particularly if you're dealing with trees in rosaceae, you know, nectarines, peaches, pears, a lot of the things that we grow here that are a little more temperate. If you're trying to grow avocados or mangoes, they require, and like you know that it's a cultivar that grows tall, yeah, it might be worth your time to put some work in and keep them closer to the ground. But that's getting into, I mean, and that's your ultimate objective, is to make it easier for you. You're kind of, the more you cut trees and the more you prune them throughout their lifetimes, you are decreasing the lifespan of the tree, because you're exposing it to more bacteria and pathogens that can get into it and infect it over the long run. But it's probably going to be safer for you a lot of the time to have the tree kind of shorter than having to go high up into the tree and get these fruit. So, I mean, you know, like all management practices, it depends on your objective. And the pruning that you do for these taller trees to keep them smaller, you're only going to be able to do so much of it. I mean, it's going to look a little bit like topping potentially as well. But, I mean, that's not something, that's kind of an advanced side of pruning that you know, maybe I'll try and keep that in mind when I do a class on pruning at some point.
Thanks, John. That was all the questions for now. And if you guys have any more questions, just type them in the chat box.
Well, thanks, Tia. So, okay. So here's the next thing here is I want to cover some tree defects. So one of the most obvious and biggest issues with trees are liens, and like they can occur very rapidly. So if you look at these liens, not all of them are the same. And the reason for that is that these liens, you kind of have they grew under different circumstances, these trees. This tree in the all the way here on the right hand side, this is called a sweep. This is a tree that that was growing, that may have fallen over at one point and has grown upward in response. But you can see that, like, based on the structure of the base here and the fact that it's corrected itself, that it probably is not in a huge amount of risk anymore of falling over. The tree has probably responded internally and through its root system to compensate. Now this tree in the middle here, which this is called a bow. This tree is bowing. It's growing straight up, and then it's growing in a direction. So what's probably going on here is it's growing towards light. It's probably like, a lot of times you see this like next to roadways. The tree is trimmed up and it's growing straight, and it doesn't have anywhere to grow on the backside of it. So it just starts growing towards the roadway. So this is a pretty common form, and it's not something to really be concerned about either, because the tree has been growing this way. Now, what is something that you have to worry about is when a tree develops a lien. And the situation on the left-hand side is a tree that has over time, was probably growing quite straight, but had something happen to it. The soil could have become overly moist, and it's not getting proper tension like throughout the soil. It's potentially, it was wind threw it off a little bit, and it's still kind of hanging there. But it's hanging in there, but it hasn't fallen over yet. So this situation, you can see that this stem isn't responded at all. These other trees, you can see that the stems have responded, and consequently, like there's internal structures that are, the tree is mechanically able to support itself based on the lien. This tree does not have any of that. And so this is the dangerous situation. If you see a tree that suddenly starts leaning like this, that's not good. That's one of the highest levels of risk that we have, is for when a tree develops risk. So that one is something to always keep in mind. So other things to keep in mind here are fungal growths. This is armillaria. This is a common root fungus. When this is present, the trees a lot of times are losing, their roots are dying. And so the roots are very key for keeping the tree like able to support itself and grounding it, keeping that tensile strength in the ground. And so when this happens, like all the little fibers that it's using to grip the ground, so to speak, they're dying rapidly. So that's something that's not a good situation, and is definitely a fungus to pay attention to. It kind of has a sweet aroma. It smells like honey. People call them honey mushrooms sometimes. So something, and they're fairly common here in Florida. Another type of fungus to be aware of is called Ganoderma. This one, it doesn't focus as much on the roots typically. It focuses more on the base of the tree, where that union to the ground, to the base is. And it's also called butt rot because of, it's at the butt of the tree. So just something else that can lead to a lot of, you know, fast decay. It also affects palms. This picture on the left-hand side is a palm. So just those are, in Florida, those are the two biggest fungi that we have to look out for here. So another situation, so this ties into the leaning tree that I was showing you, is when you can see the root plate lifting. You can see here that these are trees that are intact, but the root plate is starting to move underneath of it, and it's because these trees would be probably leaning a little bit as well. And you can see on the right-hand side, these were trees that were, you know, starting to lean and like had their roots lifted. And so anyway, that's something else to pay attention to as well. So another feature to keep in mind is existing damage, mechanical damage that can be occurred, like from probably other trees, automobiles, etc. And
So you're done.
you're gonna just hang out in the seminar? Okay, thanks, Ed.
I saw Tia was down there on the other side watching.
Okay. And so they test for another thing to keep in mind is advanced trunk decay. And the way they test for this a lot of times is with mallets. And, you know, and it can be very hard to detect like visually. So this is something that like requires like usually an arborist to look into. And unfortunately, we can't tell a lot of the time. Even trained arborists that come by and take a look, they're not able to tell like the state of decay without advanced equipment. Like this thing here is called a sonic tomographer. It's something that they go by and like they're able to put them in place and they can detect sound throughout the different parts of the tree. So they'll go through and tap it with a device that sends a vibration through the tree. And then based on how fast that vibration moves from where it's hit to these other devices, it's able to create an internal image of the tree, what it looks like. So unfortunately, that's a very expensive piece of equipment and is not available to most of us. So we're kind of just guess, you know, like the mallet is the closest thing that we have for guessing that how much decay there is internally. Another big thing to keep in mind is weak branch unions. And, you know, live oaks here tend to have these a lot of times. As I showed earlier, there's often a lot of included bark. And you can see that a lot of times there's not even a lot of internal structure that's shared. So that internal structure that is already weak to begin with, where these unions occur, and it's actually quite weak. Just, you know, like where these branches diverge from each other when there's too much clustering. Another big thing to keep in mind is just to look up and be aware of dead branches. They're oftentimes not attached to the trees very well. They can be oftentimes be large, and but they're also some of the easier things to take care of for arborists to remove in terms of mediating risk. So, and just something about overall health of your trees. Just, you know, as I kind of talked about, that there were different stages of the life of a tree. You know, they go to mature to over mature. And once they get to this over mature phase, a lot of the time, they start to lose leaf area throughout. And so that's something just to keep in mind is like just the overall state of your tree and the condition of your tree. And the way that you can get kind of just a quick proxy for the condition of it is just how much leaves there are in place throughout the entirety of the tree. Like, is it looking sparse, basically? So you might not have a lot of control over some of the conditions that your tree has, but sometimes you might have control over the environment where the tree might be falling, or where or if the whole tree is going to fail, or the targets or the risk features might be. So the thing to keep in mind is these targets. And for example, like if there's a tree that is not looking very good and you can move a bench or something like that away from it, or if like if the tree has a big leaning stem and it's moving towards that stem is in the direction of your house, your house is a target at that point. So just keep these things in mind when you're trying to think about like these risk features. Just think about where they are in the environment and where they are to objects and people that have value.